Hello, poodling arounders. How are you today? Now, this is really exciting for me because I've been wanting to bring you this particular podcast for some time, ever since I visited Denmark in September 2022. That journey for me was a significant one. I didn't want to just see the Little Mermaid and the land of Hans Christian Andersen. I wanted to get in touch with what by then I'd started to refer to as my Viking roots. Let's go back a little. This story actually begins when I was handling some of my travel PR work in the county of Northumberland. That county is home to the UNESCO site of Hadrian's Wall, and I was meeting pretty close to the Roman wall in a self-catering cottage. There were maybe 14 or so people there, and suddenly, prior to the meeting, there was a stir. The postman had knocked. The owner of the cottage was excited by this rat-a-tat-tat at the door, as I would have been if Axl Rose had come visiting me. Well, maybe she wasn't that uber excited, but she was pretty thrilled. It transpired that a DNA testing kit had been delivered. Now, there was a very good reason for this. DNA testers had previously proved that there is a not-to-be-ignored proportion of people who live around Hadrian's Wall who have Syrian DNA. The reason is that the Romans brought the very best experts from various fields to defend their most northern imperial boundary. So there were German troops, Dalmatian soldiers, and most notably a crack team of archers from Syria. It's the latter who are felt to be responsible for the Syrian DNA that's traceable in the local population. So I was absolutely hooked by all of this, but then someone moved the conversation to Viking veins. Now, I've since come to believe that this is actually tendons and not veins, but on the day I turned over my wrists to see if one or two tendons could be seen running up from the hand on the inner side of the lower arm. If you have two, it's a sign you've got Viking blood, I was told. And now I was truly beside myself as I had two in both arms. Now, this sort of built on an obsession I'd had with Vikings, from Kirk Douglas, from my first Italian teacher always saying, "Oh, Jana has such a Viking look about her." Oh, by the way, there's nothing dodgy about that. Jana is my name in Italian class, so I do have two identities. Furthermore, wherever I've travelled in the world, people always thought I was German or Scandinavian. I love looking at the sea. I love hanging around harbours and boats, even though I can't sail. I'm fascinated by waves. And when I've lived in a place like Cambridge, that's nowhere near the sea, I've absolutely pined to be by the sea. But in many ways, I've also had a gut feeling that I've always sort of been Viking. I simply knew that I, too, needed to have a DNA kit. So I got one, and I cannot describe how nervous I felt about the results. I've never ever felt very British, to the extent that people say that I change the minute I get to a European country and seem to assimilate myself within minutes. So the last thing I wanted was for my legendary gut feeling to be wrong and to be proven to be 100% English. I've watched a lot of DNA journey programmes and really have felt quite sorry for those who've had nothing remotely exotic in their DNA. I didn't want that to be me. So when the results were being flashed up bit by bit on my computer screen, I honestly thought I was going to be sick. Imagine my delight when the test told me I was only 26% English, and then even more joy came with finding that I'm more than 16% Scandinavian, and then lo and behold, I'm more than 55% North and Western European, and even 2% Balkan. To me, this makes real sense. One half of my family originates from Yorkshire, where the Vikings established a stronghold around places like York. The other half come from the south coast, just a short hop for the Normans after they crossed the English Channel and drove out King Harold. However, where the 55% comes from isn't exactly certain. Perhaps there is a German connection after all. More investigation needs to be done, but COVID came along and I need to pick up on all of that again. Anyway, let me tell you, doing all of this completely changes your perspective on life. I can remember thinking, I know who I am. And one thing that I've realised is that I do feel very in touch with my Viking roots, as I put it, and I'm sure that I even suffer a bit of the renowned Viking hand cramp. When I touched down in Denmark, it really sort of felt like going home. And then everyone on the streets and in eateries thought I was Danish and tried to talk to me in Danish, which was a huge compliment. So, whilst I did all the usual touristy things of trekking around Copenhagen on the metro and by foot, and narrowly avoiding being mowed down by bicycles on many an occasion, I also hired a car. Once I actually got to Denmark and started to drive it, I had some confidence in travelling around, and that's when I decided that I would definitely head to Roskilde, where I knew the Viking ship museum was to be found. It has to be said that had I been sure that I would go there, I might have been able to do more pre-visit planning and got more out of it. But hindsight is a wonderful thing, isn't it? Anyway, it takes about 40 minutes to get to Roskilde from Copenhagen by car, and motoring really isn't too bad in Denmark. You certainly don't need the Valium that's required when driving on an Italian autostrada, for instance, and I really don't mind driving on the wrong side of the road. I actually get so used to it that I then find it difficult to remember to drive on the left when getting back to the UK. The only really weird and sort of slightly tricky thing is that on Danish motorways, traffic enters the motorway in a really strange way, as all lanes suddenly disappear and you suddenly find yourself in a sort of no man's land where everybody's fighting for position. I just remember thinking, it's okay, Jane, you've driven dodgems at a few fairgrounds, so just keep avoiding everyone around you. Now, for this podcast, I had hoped to be able to talk to somebody from the museum, but that's not been possible. So I'm going to give you all the reasons why you really need to head to this place, even if you don't have two tendons in your wrist or Viking DNA. But I'm also going to give you the advice that I wish I'd had before heading there, as I think the experience would have been more powerful. So hold on to your Viking helmets, as here we go. What you've just heard there was the sound of a Viking boat being manoeuvred out of harbour by a crew of 60 people, all manning their oars and responding to the instructions of the person in the bow. These instructions are then repeated, as you may have heard, by someone who's midship. So literally everyone in the boat can hear and respond. That was the Viking way. And this is, in a nutshell, what the Viking Ship Museum is all about. Recreating the seafaring ways of the Vikings of Denmark from the 11th century in as authentic and realistic a manner as possible. Now, the history of the museum really goes back to 1962, a great year, as it's both the year that I was born and the year that my favourite musician was born. It's also one in which archaeologists were able to get on the track of some very useful information that had come from divers a few years earlier in 1959. These divers had been splashing around, creating bubbles in Roskilde Fjord, and had, to their surprise, discovered some wrecks, which they thought were medieval ships. They came back with a piece of wood, and that was then analysed in a laboratory, and it was actually found to be Viking. Knowing there was something of huge historical interest in the waters of the fjord, work began to get this marvellous find actually brought to life during the summer of 1962. Around 1,000 years after the boats had been sunk, a cofferdam was constructed around the site so that water could be removed from it and access to the boats attained. Gradually and carefully, seawater was pumped out of the cofferdam. Being careful was really important because by then, archaeologists recognised that there were what were originally believed to be 6 Viking ships lying in the mud on the seabed. Each of them had clearly been deliberately sunk, having been weighted down with stones. If the seawater had been pumped out too quickly, the weight of the stones could have destroyed what remained of the fragile vessels. So it really was slowly catch a monkey. A painstaking approach was taken, with stones and other things weighting down the vessels being removed piece by piece, and thousands of other items were recovered and brought to the surface. The archaeologists, with the eyes of the world upon them, managed to salvage the Viking ships that have become known as the 5 Skulderleer, boats. Curiously, these 5 boats are numbered 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6. This is because, if you remember, I told you that the archaeologists thought that there was a 4th boat. When they got further into the process, they discovered that boats 2 and 4 were actually the same boat, but it would have then been too confusing to alter the numbering system. It's no exaggeration to say that these 5 boats found lying deep in mud turned Nordic maritime culture upside down. As the museum says, they've been a kind of portal taking us back to the Viking Age. The light they have helped cast on history and the society of the time has been immense. Each vessel had fared differently in the sea. In one case, Skudalea 2, only 25% remained. The best preserved, Skudalea 3, was 75% intact. The challenge of the archaeologists who were privileged enough to be dealing with one of the most significant finds in history was to piece together the rest. Now, as I said, thousands of pieces were recovered, so it was a question of mapping, measuring, and plotting everything. They had to literally build the story of the 5 Skudalev vessels, so named because they were found close to Skudalev. This was despite them having come from an age and culture in which little was written down, so there were no written clues to go on. Only by studying each object in minute detail could the archaeologists begin to tell the story of the 5 Skudalev ships and lay the foundations for the story that the Viking Ship Museum tells today. Now, whilst I love a good jigsaw puzzle, I'm really not sure I would have wanted to tackle this one, with patience not being something for which I'm renowned. The care the marine archaeologists took was just phenomenal. It can honestly be said that each of the Skudalev ships was a beautiful but silent framework, hiding secrets that had to be uncovered in order to appreciate Danish Viking culture. The team who took charge of this project created one-to-one drawings in clear plastic foil, recording the minutest details about the ships and every individual component. All of this work was carried out shortly after excavation, providing a true and accurate record of the size of each piece. And this was really important, as timber shrinkage did later occur. The main starting point for those seeking to tell these secrets was then to try to recreate these boats in cardboard. This was achieved on a scale of 1 to 10, with planks secured by pins and inserted in their corresponding rivet holes, so as to demonstrate how the planks formed the hull of the ship. If, like me, you were a girl who sometimes got to tackle Hornby models of Spitfires with tubes of glue and little mini pots of paint, I imagine it was a bit like that. From there, the models were built in wood, reconstructed from preserved material. The quest was then to build each of the 5 vessels in the style and size in which they would originally have taken to sea, despite not having any clues about the rudders, the rigging, the sails, or the anchor. This all had to be deduced from other archaeological finds from the Viking Age, and by referencing Nordic clinker boat building tradition. As a result of the documenting, analysing, and in-depth process undertaken by the experts, it was possible to suggest what each of the vessels had been used for and where it may have ventured during its life. This has been done by studying everything from axe markings and other features to the type of wood used and the modifications that were made. There is no doubt that, at the time of their sinking, it was the end of life for each of these boats, which would have been worn out and redundant at that point. The deliberate sinking was done with real purpose. The intention was defence of the early Christian cathedral town of Roskilde and its inhabitants. The aim was most probably to keep Norwegian enemy ships at bay. The arrival of an enemy fleet on the horizon anywhere along this stretch of Danish coast would have led to the sequential lighting of beacons at each location, with each sending a warning to settlements further down. The 5 vessels were sunk at the narrowest point in the fjord, in a sailing channel that was the most direct route to Roskilde, and just outside the village of Roskilde. The first 3 were sunk in the second half of the 11th century, with a further 2 then being sunk to add to the defences 20 years later. This provided a permanent barrier which prevented enemy ships from entering Roskilde. When they were in their prime, however, the boat's owners left vital clues within the boat's structure, which could typically be analysed, despite little of the shell remaining in some cases. The analysis highlights the specific purpose and background that each of the boats had. Starting with Roskilde 1, this was Ottar, an ocean-going cargo ship around 16.5 metres in length and able to travel at a speed of 12.5 knots with its sail. The life story of the 6 to 8 or 15 at most men who manned this boat has been imagined for the purposes of wonderful commentary available on a Viking ship museum interpretation that you can find on the Museum app. If only I'd known about this app when I visited. Rather than wandering into the beautiful waterside Viking ship hall and feeling taken aback by shipwrecked structures that look like dinosaurs in the Natural History Museum in London, I might have fully appreciated what was going on. I don't recall anything telling me about the app, so do seek it out. The Museum app is shared by several attractions and museums, so if you need to download that, you then need to find the Viking Ship Museum's part within it. When you do, you will discover that the original Roskilde 1 was built in Sognefjord, Norway, around 1030, and could have traded in everything from walrus tusks from Greenland to furs, hides, and reindeer antlers, calling at major Scandinavian ports such as Hedeby, where trading stalls were numerous and goods came from all over the world. Her own cargo could have been furs, bread, silk, slaves, iron, ropes, or timber, and she probably played her part in the very earliest globalisation of trade. Roskilde 2, on the other hand, has been proven to have been a warship, and is one of the longest Viking longships ever to have been found. Remarkably, the archaeologists have determined that this boat was built in Dublin and even underwent repairs in Dublin before setting sail for Roskilde. This boat with a 112-metre squared sail was no ordinary vessel, and one of the elite of its day, being manned by 60 to 75 men and able to travel at the equivalent of 30 kilometres per hour. So why was this Irish boat in Roskilde? The app suggests in a most historically enticing way that it transported Guta of Wessex, the daughter of Harold Godwinson, to Denmark, some time after her exile to Ireland, following the death of her father at the Battle of Hastings. She and her brothers may have sought help from the Danish king to try to reclaim England. We do know that this boat sailed to Denmark sometime between 1066 and 1074, and historical sources say that Guta and her brothers came to Denmark in 1069. So who knows? It's up to you to decide, I guess. Roskilde 3 was a coastal trader and probably a family boat of about 14 metres in length, using the motorway of the Viking Age, the sea, to transport the family goods to market, whether that was corn, barrels of fish, or even livestock. Towns were relatively new developments and offered farmers new ways of earning money. A crew of around 5 to 8 people could sail her. Scudero 5, of which 65% of the hull and the entire port side remained in the sea, was actually a boat with a bit of mixing and matching going on, having been built from both new and reused timber, with oak, pine, and ash all used. Decorative markings suggest she was a smaller 17.3-metre long longship from a Viking war fleet, dating from 1030, and with 13 pairs of oars to accommodate 30 warriors. A new reconstruction of her will bring all of this to life very soon. And finally, Scudelev 6 was a fishing boat built in the same place in Norway as Scudelev 1 around 1030, and perhaps used for fishing, whaling, or seal hunting. The researchers found that the boat had been adapted probably to be able to transport larger cargoes, and possibly reflecting a move away from fishing and towards trading with the new towns it had set up. But piecing together the boat's stories and building the cardboard and wooden models has been just a small part of what had gone on at Roskilde. The models were just stepping stones to full reconstructions of each of the boats, with some reconstructed more than once to try to further perfect the final vessel. Probably this was the link that wasn't that obvious to me during the visit, but maybe the app would have helped. Reconstructing the boats and turning the dinosaur-like wrecks into what is a real floating and sailing boat has been an immense task and provides the museum with another major part of the visitor experience. This comprises a plethora of workshops and buildings that are home to craftspeople working in the true Viking tradition, with true Viking-style tools and the materials that the original Viking boat builders would have used, or whatever is closest today to that particular material. When you arrive at the Roskilde Museum site, you first wander past a large green area that, when I visited, was a site for Viking settlement-style tents and barbecue-type cooking setup. Viking shields and weaponry also seemed to be scattered around as the barbecue smoke floated across the area. You then arrive at a place in which huge logs are laid out in a large open boatyard space. The saltwater smell from the fjord here mingles with that of tar, and if you venture into the log-strewn area, you will feel the crunch of wood chip and fresh wood shavings beneath the feet. This is not a tourist demonstration area for lumberjacks and woodworkers as such, although work here can certainly draw in the crowds. It is, in fact, a real live working environment that in 2023 has apparently been a hive of activity as the pace behind the reconstruction of Scudelev 5 has gathered pace. Here in June 2023, the site welcomed the arrival of a huge 212-year-old oak log that visitors have been able to see expertly cleaved by experienced boat builders using just the tools that their Viking counterparts would have deployed: mallets, wedges, and a lot of raw muscle. The amazing sight has been the first stage in a process that will see the log cleaved into halves, quarters, eighths, and sixteenths before axes then create smooth, flexible, and strong planks. This and wood cleaved from another 10-metre oak will provide the planks for the strakes, the horizontal rows of planks. 4 of the strakes in the original Scudelev 5 were made from oak, with 2 made from reused pine and another strake made of reused ash wood. The skill behind log splitting is immense. The craftsmen need to know exactly how and when to drive the split into the log according to the log's fibres. Getting it wrong could be a bit of a disaster. All around this boat building area are other places in which to have a nosy, whether that's the rope workshop displaying an array of different ropes, the blacksmiths or the sailmakers, places where you can discover seal hide and woolen sails and cloth. It's an amazing place to visit. This all hints at what life in the Viking Age was like, with the creation of a boat being a collaborative exercise between numerous craftspeople, the blacksmith, the coal supplier who provided the fuel that fired the blacksmith's fire, the weavers who took wool from farmers to weave their woolen sails, the providers of tar that needed to seal the boat, and so on. Just let your mind wander and drink in the scene, and you may just be able to transport your imagination back to Viking times. Listening to the stories on the app brings all of these elements together, but there are also daily guided tours of the museum in English every day at 11 a.m, which I somehow managed to miss, although I did go to a talk about Viking tools. Other talks on themes like this are provided around the site, with the individuals not working to a script, but talking through what they personally like to detail. In the holidays, there are special events and activities for families, but there are also areas of the site in which children can get creative and try to build their own miniature boats or jump on a plank and see how flexible it is at every other time. As you walk around the charming harbour, you can see the various boats that have been reconstructed, alongside others. In fact, there are about 50 boats in total. If you head to the centrally located Cafe Nar, right in the middle of what's known as Museum Island, you might be bugged by a wasp as I was, but also actually now taste a Viking ship. Yes, I said taste a Viking ship. How does that work? Well, the cafe has worked with the local brewery to create a brown ale that has been brewed with wood chips from Roskilde 3. These are burned in an oven and made into an extract, which then is mixed with the beer to create what is described as a beautiful dark brown tipple with an earthy almond taste. Wherever you are, inside the museum's Viking ship hall or outside it, if you love the sea and are mesmerised by it as much as I am, you can gaze across the fjord and imagine those past times. The days on which the light of dawn would emerge and allow you to see a chieftain's boat about to land to recruit local men for the service of the king. You can think of how it must have felt to see the beacons being lit on the hilltops, warning of impending danger. You can imagine the excitement but nervousness of those embarking on a cargo ship to head off and encounter new sensations, foods, people from other races and cultures. You can put yourself in the shoes of a Viking warrior, rowing across frozen seas with a shield ready to affix to the boat for some form of protection. When I was there was a hive of activity, all centred on one of the boats, the reconstruction of Roskilde 2, the Viking warship from Dublin. The boat, the Glendalough, also known as the Sea Stallion, was launched in 2004 and recreated a historic Viking journey by sailing back to Dublin in 2007, with volunteers stepping aboard and taking the risk of making it across stormy seas and in potentially freezing conditions. Not knowing what I now know, I just had to pick up some audible snippets here and there from passers-by, who intimated that volunteers turn up at times to help test the boat out on the water. So I spent a good 2 hours watching all of this rigmarole of people jumping aboard with rucksacks, checking things in different places on the boat, chatting, and then all suddenly opening lunch boxes and grabbing a snack. I waited and waited. Remember, I'm not very patient. And I waited, just hoping that the boat was going to sail. Eventually, all began to climb on board and assume their rowing positions. Excitement ensued. Oars were inserted through the holes in the boat, and a person took to the bow to issue the orders, then transmitted to midship, just as you heard in the audio track earlier. The ropes were untied, and the boat began to drift before the entire crew started to gently row the boat out of the harbour. It was absolutely mesmerising to witness this, and to run around the quay to get another perspective. I watched the boat glide out to sea smoothly with the entire crew rowing in unison as one, just as you can imagine Viking crews having done when embarking on a raid. It turned around at sea before disappearing from view, but having created lasting and amazing memories that I will never forget. The girl with Viking roots has seen the closest thing to a Viking ship she'll ever see in her life set sail across a fjord in which the original, now housed in a museum just metres away, was once sunk to defend this land. You do need to be able to make the links between what you see inside the museum, in the harbour and in the boatyard, and the app is a massive conduit for that. If you can do that and are an appreciator of craftsmanship in all its forms, as well as perhaps history and archaeology, you will absolutely love this place without even leaping aboard a boat inside the museum to get a feel for what life would have been like. You can take a deeper dive into the history of the era and immerse yourself more fully by seeing some of the exhibits that are also on display, whether that's Viking coins, tortoise brooches, game pieces, helmet, jewellery, or bits and pieces of Viking boats and arms. Listening to the app will bring everything to life as you view it, and it will make your spine tingle as you allow your mind to wander and imagine how some of the characters in the stories that are told on the app would have felt about their life on this shoreline. Now understand that there are often opportunities to sail on some of the boats in the harbour, along with experts who can teach you about everything that is known as raw sailing, that is, sailing with a raw Viking sail and in the Viking way. These trips take place between May and September. There is also a regular programme of events that you can check out online at the website, which is www.vikingeskibsmuseet.dk. The Viking Ship Museum's Facebook page is absolutely fascinating and fantastic, and they post really interesting and insight-filled material in both English and Danish. This can tell you exactly what's going on, whether it's a talk, exhibition, the day they put the boats in the water, or the day in which they haul them out of the water in November. As you leave the museum, perhaps to visit the lovely town of Roskilde and its cathedral, key reasons why Roskilde became such an important place on the Danish coast, you may be left speculating just how important the Vikings were to the development of global trading routes and Northern European culture. You'll undoubtedly leave marvelling at the dedication that runs like a pattern through a stick of rock at this museum, whether that dedication comes from archaeologists, the draftspeople, the model creators, the amazing craftspeople, or the volunteers who take to the seas and test the recreations, feeding information back for tweaks and refinements to be made as greater knowledge of how the boats were sailed is acquired. You'll have a great understanding of just how pivotal seafaring was within Viking society, whether it led to trading, collecting fish for the dinner table, exploring, settling overseas, or launching attacks on enemies. It transformed Viking culture, expanding knowledge of other places, religions, foreign food, money systems, and ways of life, and opening up transport to exciting regions such as the Arab world. Viking seafaring was a cornerstone of globalization. You can visit the museum and do all of this I've described virtually every day of the year from January the 1st to December the 31st, but again do check Facebook. When Storm Pier recently roared in, the water levels were too high for the museum to open, and such storms are unfortunately becoming all too frequent in a time of climate change. One reason why a new museum building on higher land is planned to open in around 4 years' time. Visiting the museum can also be a highly cost-effective experience if you have a Copenhagen card. Now, this is a card that offers access to many, many attractions and museums at a discounted price once you've purchased the card. I use it a lot, not just in Copenhagen, but in a variety of palaces and other places in the surrounding countryside. And I have to say that having bought many of this type of card around the world, the Copenhagen card probably gives better value than most, so do check it out. If you do visit this Viking Ship Museum, what you must absolutely promise me that you will do is focus on the horizon in front of you. just as those Viking-era Roskilde residents did. To not do so would almost seem to be doing them and their marvellously enterprising and surprisingly advanced ways a huge and massive disservice. And after all, for all I know, some of them could have been my ancestors. Expanding horizons is, of course, what life is all about when you are poodling around, and there really is nowhere better than on the shores of this atmospheric and beautiful fjord. Do let me know if you visit this incredibly inspiring museum in Roskilde and tell me how you find it. But until that day comes, have fun with your other poodling around adventures and take very good care of yourself.